I think the most beautiful way to work with jazz harmony is to work on chord melody, the type of playing that you hear from Barney Kessel and Joe Pass, where the melody is used as a foundation that you can add amazing chords to. But you do need to work on it the right way to really get all the benefits. You don't want to just play something from paper trying to make your way from chord diagram to chord diagram. You want to explore all the amazing colors and embellishments that you can add to the music. I sort of stumbled my way into chord melody, and weirdly enough, the first song I ever made a chord melody arrangement of was actually a song that I don't really like, and when I made it, I had never heard of Barney Kessel or Joe Pass, who later became my main inspirations for this. I was finishing a stay at a folk high school, which is a really Danish thing, a type of boarding school for adult education. I'd spent 8 months practicing and trying to learn jazz after getting my bachelor's degree in mathematics at the university. I wasn't very far in learning jazz, but having the time to practice and play with others for that long was of course incredibly useful. And I used it to prepare for getting into school to get a degree in jazz performance, which I did in The Hague a few years later. It was in June and I was sitting outside in the sun practicing, something that I'm sure you can tell I don't do very often. A few months earlier, I'd bought a real book, which at the time was an incredible source of information, since this was before the internet and online resources. It was all books and CDs, and I hardly had any when it came to jazz. In fact, the only thing I had was the real book and 5 or 6 jazz CDs, which were mostly Schofield and a little Charlie Parker. During my stay at the school, whenever I've been jamming with a friend of mine who was a saxophone player, he always wanted to play Misty because he had a Dexter Gordon version of that song that he really liked. Practicing in the sun, I was getting bored with the arpeggios and scales, so I started flipping through the real book, looking for songs or something that I could mess around with. And then I came across Misty in there, so I decided to try and play that. Now, my favorite major 7 voicing at the time was actually the basic root position major 7. Very advanced and hip, I know. And while I slowly spelled my way through the chords, then I realized that the melody was the top note of that chord in the first bar. And this really made some things click for me. At the time, I had heard people play chord melody arrangements, especially Schofield and Wes off my CDs. Now, while I hadn't really thought about doing that myself, then I realized that it could actually be fun to try and see if I could make my own arrangement, put the chords under the melody of this song. I was pretty lucky that there were 2 things I already had going for me working on this chord melody arrangement. I could read music well enough to figure out how to play the melody, and I was also aware that I needed to transpose the melody up an octave, which of course makes it a lot easier to put chords under it. But it still seemed like a very complicated task, and figuring this out is really also what made the foundation for the 2 rules that I always give to my students when they're making their own chord melody arrangements. Misty doesn't actually really fit with the first thing that I always tell my students to do: play the melody on the 2 top strings. Now, the reason for this is that if you're playing it up there, then it's a lot easier to fit a chord under it. Now, for the first phrase, if you have the pickup and that long note, then that will give you this. This works great for the E flat major 7 chord, and later in the video I'm going to show you some nice suspensions that you can add here on that long note, because there are a lot of beautiful options that you can mess around with. As you can see, then already in the next phrase there's a low B flat, which of course is not possible to play on the B string, and there are actually quite a few notes in the melody that are lower than the B. Luckily, there's a fix for that. The other advice that I give is to only add chords on beats 1 and 3 in the beginning, just to make it easier to play and still keep the harmony clear when the chords are changing. This makes Misty a lot easier since the melody moves around really a lot, but only adding a chord in the important spots makes it a lot simpler to play. And that is of course already clear for the next phrase. There are 2 things that you want to notice here. As I said, playing a chord on the heavy beat sounds great, and shell voicings are extremely useful for this, because most of the time you can easily either add a shell voicing under a melody note, or even just use a shell voicing, as I'm doing here on the B flat minor 7 or the A flat major 7. And luckily that strategy is also going to be useful for the next phrase, because that has an even more busy melody with the arpeggio as a pickup. You also want to notice that I'm using an E flat 7 shell voicing, but adding an extra note on the B string to make it a complete E flat 7 with a 9 and a 13. Now, you don't have to do that, you can just play the shell voicing, but in this case it's an easy way to add an extension to the chord, and you'll see me do that again in the next example. What is happening in the song is actually pretty simple. You get a tonic chord and then a 2-5 to 4, and then it goes to 4 minor as a way to get back to the tonic. And this is actually a very common type of progression in jazz standard. So recognizing what it is very useful and will make it a lot easier to play other songs and turn those into chord melody arrangements. Knowing what is happening in a chord progression actually always gives you a lot more information about what will work in terms of changing the chords or adding passing chords or other nice things that I'm going to return to later in the video. The first A flat minor 7 is played as a bar chord, and again, you could just play the shell voicing and the melody, but adding the fifth is practical and it actually also sounds great. If you want to think about this in visual terms, then I am really just seeing the melody and the shell voicing, and then I know that adding the fifth is an option, so I just do that. In general, this is really about knowing how chords are constructed, and when you're working on harmonizing a melody like this, then you're really developing your flexibility and your knowledge with jazz chords in a way where you're really using it and really seeing it in action. It's much better than just theory. Now, if you're just reading an arrangement and trying to play that, then that's nowhere nearly as useful because you're not really getting better at working with the chords and the melody and choosing how it should sound. You're just trying to read a piece of music and a harmonization that somebody else made, which is kind of like reading a transcription of a solo versus improvising your own solo. It's really something else. But before you start interpreting the harmony, it's useful to just have sort of a basic arrangement to work from, similar to what I made on that summer day. The next part of the melody is actually emphasizing the third of the chord for 4 chords in a row. And just to return to my original take on this song, I hadn't learned any systems for jazz chords. I just looked at the notes and then tried to find a voicing that would fit. And I already knew this E flat major 7 and this C minor 7. So that's what I used. And together with the shell voicings for the F minor 7 and the B flat 7, then you have this. You can see how it's still very useful to only play the F minor 7 on beat 1 and then be free to skip down and play the C without having to add a complete chord there. It would not be impossible, but this is definitely a lot easier. From here, the real book suggested a G minor 7 chord, and I don't really remember what I played exactly, but instead you can also play a D flat 7 in the turnaround, which sounds a lot better. The first chord with the major 7, the melody, can easily be a little bit boring because it's just standing still, but it's a great place to add some surprising sounds. The original, of course, sounds like this. But a common variation is to turn that into a diminished suspension with a sharp 4 diminished chord, so A diminished in this case. And that actually becomes a D major triad over an E flat bass note like this. You can also use a sharp 5 as a tension that resolves later in the bar to keep things moving. Or even this Lydian augmented chord with both a sharp 11 and a sharp 5. Another option is the Barry Harris 6 diminished suspension, where it would be a D diminished over E flat. But coming from B flat 7, I don't find this super strong. You can look for tricks like this using both theory, scales, or even just experimenting with moving notes in the voicing that you're playing. Of course, if you start changing the chord and then you find something that you like, it really makes sense to also try and figure out what is actually going on so that you can use that in other songs as well. Another thing that you can start to explore is to decorate the chords with other melodies inside the chords. A very common and beautiful option is this line cliché. Here, the 2-5-1 almost becomes a Stairway to Heaven quote. If you take the A flat major 7 shell voicing and then split up the 3rd and the 7th so that they're on different strings, then you can insert a 9th in there as well, and then you have this much more colorful voicing. And this actually means that you can add this nice move on that chord where the 9th and the 7th move down to the root and the major 6. And you only find stuff like this if you're really making your own harmonizations and mess around with the chords where there's room for it. It can be useful to keep in mind that these arrangements should not be set in stone and something that you can never change. Give yourself the freedom to mess with them when you're playing them, because that's also what will help you discover a lot of things and not just play something like you're reading a classical composition. And I think this also really ties back to Barney Kessel and Joe Pass, because they're both pretty open and harmonize things on the fly when they're playing. And I think that sometimes means making it a little bit simpler to keep it flexible, but it also really opens up for making the song more your own. A great way to add more movement to a progression is to add some extra chords in there, what we call passing chords. And on a 2/5, then just walking up the scale in diatonic chords can work really well. And in bar 4, that gives you something like this. A way to really open up how you work with chords is to practice playing chord solos a la Wes and Joe Pass. This may sound like you need a million chord voicings, but actually that's not the case. And as you can see in this video, it's much more about how you think about the chords. So check out that video if you want to start using chord solos in your playing, something that will really open up both your comping and your chord melody skills.